Hello, guys and girls, and Happy New Year to you all. Yes, this is 2020, we are underway, and so this is going to be my first review of the year, and it is the new BBC Netflix co-production of Dracula, so an updating of the classic novel from Bram Stoker, of course. Many different versions over the years, many different interpretations of the character and of vampires in general over the years. And this tries to really modernise it and go for, I guess, a mixture of a lot of those different versions that we've had on screen and in media. So I've literally a few minutes ago finished watching it, so I'm gonna sort of get to it pretty quickly and my overall thoughts on the first episode. The first episode, by the way, is called The Rules of the Beast, which I think sums it up quite nicely what it's trying to do in the first episode, trying to introduce you about the myth, the legend behind the character of Count Dracula and establishing the rules in this particular version. And it's sort of directed written and created by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, who worked together on Sherlock, of course, and also worked together on The League of Gentlemen, so they have a fair bit of history together. And Gatiss, I know, has a real sort of horror heritage, so there was big expectations going into this new version, and it's going to air over consecutive nights on the BBC, so all sort of the next few nights, obviously going up to Friday, and then at the weekend it's going to all drop on Netflix, so all 3 episodes will be made available from the weekend. So it's quite a nice little partnership with Netflix and the BBC, where the BBC get to roll it out over 3 nights at the start of the year, and then Netflix or be able to put them all up at the weekend. And obviously they'll also be available on the BBC iPlayer if you don't have Netflix. So just to the casting, because this is a different way of doing the story, we have the Dracula character himself. He's played by a Danish actor called Claes Bang, who some people might know from a film called The Square, which came out a couple of years ago, a very sort of critically acclaimed art house film. It won one of the big awards at Cannes. I hear very good things. I still haven't seen it, but I hear that's really, really good. So some people might know him from there. So he's in the title role as Dracula. You also have this character of Johnny or Jonathan, who's like a lawyer character who in this first episode is sort of like the narrator sort of thing. He's telling the story in the past of his encounter with Dracula. He's played by John Heffernan. And you also have 1 or 2 other familiar faces. There's Dolly Wells, who plays the sort of main sister of the piece, if you like, because you get this sort of story being told like in a nunnery, and there's a big reveal to her character towards the end. But Sister Agatha is sort of her name at the start of the episode. There's also Joanne Skellen, who people know from various things on TV. She's been in a few films as well. She plays another one of the sisters at like the convent, so like the sort of head sort of sister. And so a few familiar faces, a few faces people won't have seen necessarily before. So I have very mixed feelings on this. I think sort of because each episode is an hour and a half, which I think, certainly based on this first episode, I think is overdoing it a bit. I think an hour would probably be about right for each episode. I did feel the last half an hour of this particularly starting to drag a little bit. And I think there is this cut-off point where for the first half of the episode, or for the first hour, let's say, I mean, I was lukewarm on it, but there were at least things that were grabbing my attention. You know, there was a lot of style, there was a lot of mood. The performances were sort of very solid. And I could appreciate some of the things it was doing. So although I was a little bit indifferent, I think there was enough sort of keeping my attention. But then it's the final half an hour of the episode where it really goes off in this sort of crazy direction, and where it just lost me sort of altogether. And I think that's when I really felt the pacing, and I felt like, yeah, maybe this should have been an hour. It feels overextended at like an hour and a half. So you sort of get this back and forth jumping back and forth in time structure, where at the beginning the Johnny character arrives at the convict and he looks very, you know, sort of worn down and decrepit, and immediately you get this very sort of gothic sort of murky sort of feel, where you have like one of the first shots, which is a really good shot, is actually of like a moth just coming at the camera. But you can tell this guy has been through a lot, so he starts telling the story to, as I said, Sister Agatha, Dolly Wells, sorry, and another sister who there's a reveal of, which I'll get to. So full spoilers as I talk more about the episode. And so Jonathan is a lawyer. As I said, he's recounting the story of his encounter with Dracula. So he's recounting him going to this castle in obviously Transylvania. He's been summoned there, and how he is sort of manipulated by Dracula, how he senses other people are there, and that he's trying to save those other people, or at least find out if they're really there. So the structure is that for the first half of the episode that it jumps back and forth, and we slowly get this sense of Dracula like manipulating him, overcoming him, and we get reveals as it's sort of jumping back and forth. So I think it's sort of because one of the big questions early on is that Agatha sort of says, "Did you have sex with Count Dracula?" And it's all, you get this sort of heightened sort of accent on her because we find out later she's meant to be Dutch, and again, you might have already guessed where this is sort of going, but you know, it's this very sort of provocative sort of delivery of the line, and that's how we cut to the titles. But so it's kind of playing with the sexuality of the Dracula character, this sort of theatricality, and it's kind of winking and nodding at being something a bit more modern and knowing. But I think the problem is really then it's sort of trying to be too much, and overall it just feels like they're having a lot of fun with the character. They're having a lot of fun with like the heritage of the character, and I think the performance of Claes Bang is really solid, really like his performance itself is very good. I mean, when he first appears, he's very, I think, charismatic. He's very kind of slippery. He has that sort of sort of feel for Dracula. He has that very sort of classy, like malevolent sort of thing. But the problem is, as time goes on, you start getting a lot of him. You start getting maybe a bit too much of him. And I think the tone gradually just gets a bit unbalanced. It just gets a bit too forced and knowing. And as I said, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And I think over time he just gets a bit too exposed. And he sort of feels a bit too much like a stand-up comedian, if you like. There's a bit too much of kind of him like enjoying himself, if you like. It's just, I think there's this sense, because this is a TV thing, because we're sort of getting more of the character, and because they're sort of doing different things with him, with his kind of manipulation, and it's all a bit more flash, sort of in your face at times. Then I think you kind of lose that sense of mystery, that sense of the wonder of the character. I think certainly in the opening, 20 minutes or so, I think there is a mood to it. There's an atmosphere. There's, the castle all looks very impressive. It looks iconic. It kind of has that feel of the classic, Transylvanian castle. I think the production values are, without question, really effective. They've spent the money well. But you do get these kind of silly OTT CGI moments. You get a moment where a blood, sort of splurts out of nowhere. I mean, there's quite a good horror sort of moment where he's hunting around in the dark, dusty sort of basement or somewhere like that down in the bowels of the castle. And suddenly he's grabbed out of nowhere, like these creatures just appear out of nowhere, out of these boxes, and they start grabbing at him, trying to strangle him. And I mean, as a moment of horror, that actually works quite well. And again, sort of top of the line production values, like with the sort of special effects makeup. But it just becomes a little too heightened. It just becomes a little too full on, especially, as I said, as the episode moves along. I think part of the problem with this episode is that it just becomes a bit too clever by half. It sort of enjoys itself a bit too much, and it just feels like it graduates itself. And I feel like it just, as I said, tries to throw a little too much into the mix. It really plays with things a lot. And I think it just overdoes that sort of aspect. It becomes a bit too hammy. It becomes a bit too much, we're going to wink at the audience. We're going to play with the rules. And it sort of feels like a grab bag of just different parts of the Dracula myth. And it just overwhelms you a bit. I think the theatricality of the character and that history, that's always been a part of Dracula, and I can understand them embracing that. But I just wish they dialed it down a little bit. There's just a certain point, I'd say about 40 minutes in, 45 minutes in, where they just tip the balance, that it becomes too much, and it kind of ruined the flow of it, and it just meant I wasn't quite enjoying it as much. I think the best line of the episode is definitely when Johnny says to Dracula, "You're a monster." And then Dracula responds, "You're a lawyer. Nobody's perfect." That's a brilliant line. That's really sharp and witty. And, it sort of makes sense. That's kind of staying on the right line, but there's some lines that are just too much like prestige, just too much kind of straight up comedy, and it just takes you out of the drama a bit too much. I think they just could have had a bit of a lighter touch with those moments. So there's sort of two or three big reveals in this opening episode. The first one is that Dracula actually killed Johnny. So the sister Agatha has sort of cottoned on to the fact that Johnny, then he does look undead. She apparently knows the signs. And so we see Dracula in the past killing Johnny, snapping his neck around. And so Sister Agatha has cottoned on to this. There's an interesting sort of touch quite early on where basically every day Dracula is becoming younger and younger and stronger, whereas Johnny is becoming older and a bit more weaker, and so it's almost like this reversal. And there's a nice little line about flesh blood. I don't know why I couldn't say that, but so there's a nice little line about that, and that's an interesting little development. So we find out that Johnny is actually dead, or undead as it is. But then you get a couple more reveals in the episode. So first of all, we find out then the other nun, the other sister, the younger one, who has been sitting in on these like meetings where Johnny's been like recounting his story. We find out she's actually Johnny's fiance, Mina. She's under a cloak. He obviously didn't recognise her. She looks quite different. And he's obviously been daydreaming about her. He's left her behind. We see a note from her at the start. And that just felt like a bit of a convenient sort of plot, like sort of twist. She says, she tracked him down and what have you. But that didn't really land for me. That sort of twist didn't really do much. And then we get the other twist, which you might have figured out, and that is then the Sister Agatha character is actually Van Helsing, the famous vampire hunter. So it's sort of setting these things in motion. But again, we get some quite really hammy, exaggerated accents like Dolly Wells' Dutch accent, and what the hell, she's having fun with it, but I think at times it did grate a little bit too much on me. But you get this big set piece towards the end of the episode where Dracula is at the gates of the convict. He's trying to like talk and manipulate his way in. And there's this whole back and forth, and again there's a couple of sort of gags because he appears in the shape of a dog, or in the form of a dog, and there's this sort of line about those bats are really noisy, do you mind? And that's again Agatha. It's kind of again this sort of comedy, this wink wink nudge nudge sort of feel to it. But this is where the episode just got really silly and kind of annoying, and just sort of took me out of it, really. It's a real sort of melodrama where they're just enjoying how much money they've got to spend on this thing, and where it just becomes rather sort of ham-fisted. So it gets mentioned that obviously as is part of the vampire lore, then they have to be invited in. They can't just come in. So this is sort of played with in this scene, and I'm pretty sure that was invented in Buffy. I think that was the first, if you go back to the film, I guess the first sort of film to sort of invent that. But they kind of play with that. Again, it's sort of a knowing sort of like gag, because Sister Agatha is sort of quite smug and upbeat, because she's like, yes, I knew that was true. So whatever. But again, there's just a sense, and they're being a bit too clever for their own sort of good with this stuff. But this scene at the gate, it just goes on for way too long, and it just becomes way too silly and sort of theatrical, and you just lose any sense of mystery, any sense of menace. And even accepting the fact that it is going for something a bit more prestige, a little bit more theatrical, it just, I think, again overdoes it, and just becomes a little too smug. Now, I think another example of them packing too much in is then Johnny then, because he's undead, so he's kind of in this sort of state, he then attempts to kill Mina. She's been left alone because they've sort of found out that Dracula is in the premises, so Sister Agatha goes to try and deal with him. So she's left alone with Johnny, who she trusts. She doesn't suspect he's going to turn on her, but of course in his state he does. He goes after her, he tries to kill her, and at the same time he's kind of wrestling with it, so he's trying to control his sort of rage. And again, this is kind of quite a well sort of worn thing with vampires on screen, this idea of them wanting to kill someone but fighting the urge when they're sort of in this undead sort of state, conflicted between the human side of them and the the vampiric side of them. So he sort of overpowers himself and actually sort of stakes himself, kills himself essentially, although he's already dead technically. So then it becomes this thing where later on we find out Johnny is actually still alive. Well, I guess that's no surprise, because as Dracula rather cleverly points out, you can't kill yourself when you're already dead, when you're a vampire. It doesn't work. So then Dracula kind of convinces Johnny to invite him in. So again, it's sort of packing all these things in, and it just feels a bit overcrowded. Now, here's my kind of issue with how this all ends in this episode is I think they had quite an interesting idea where you have the two sisters, Agatha, who's obviously Van Helsing, and Mina, and they're both, have like invested interests. We see them at the end of the episode. They're starting to research Dracula and his history. And I think you had quite an interesting idea set up where it's kind of them against Dracula and they're left to pick up the pieces. You have Mina with the connection with Johnny. You have Agatha, obviously Van Helsing. And it's kind of a different way to do this, but I think the problem is then Johnny's then still alive. He's still in the story, or I assume he's going to be. I mean, he's obviously not dead. He's invited Dracula in. That's kind of a twist we didn't need, but then it's kind of... I just feel like his story was over. There was no other purpose for him in the story. I think if it was then he was... I mean, obviously then they would have to explain why he's no longer around, if you like. But, they could have come up with a reason. So I just feel like he overcrowds the story. I think his side of the story is done, and then you could have had this sort of revenge type plot where Mina tries to get revenge for what happens to Johnny. I think that would have been a more satisfying route to go down. And obviously, we're not quite sure where they're going to go with the second episode, but it does feel like this episode is just a bit too packed. And then we get a dramatic scene towards the end where the Joanna Skellen character is killed. She's given this sort of grandiose sort of speech in the church, and then she's beheaded by Dracula, and he kind of says, she was holding her breath, sort of thing. So there you have it, really. I was a bit disappointed with this. I'm going to watch the other 2 episodes. I might as well. There was certainly good stuff in this episode, but as the episode went on, it just sort of lost me. Yeah, so far a bit of a disappointment, but I think there's still potential for the remaining episodes. I'll have to see how it goes. But there you have it. That's the first episode of BBC and Netflix new version of Dracula. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below if you've seen the episode, and like and subscribe. You can get me up on Twitter at Keith Beard if you look me up on there. Also on Facebook and on Letterboxd as Bookhouseboy80 on Letterboxd if you want to check out my movie reviews and sort of ratings. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon. Goodbye.